Sifford to join me so that you can see her while I introduce her. And let's see, I'm going to pin us both. Let's see. Okay, so you can see us. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. FitzPatrick Sifford. She is an assistant professor at Muhlenberg College, where she teaches a variety of classes on the early modern world. And that includes things such as the colonial Americas, Renaissance art in Europe, and also pre-Columbian art. She has published on a number of topics, some of which I think are especially relevant to what we are going to be having her talk with us about today. She recently published an article in Ethnohistory about Mexican manuscripts and the first images of Africans in the Americas. And she has a forthcoming essay called A Fly in Milk, Fears of Black Invisibility in New Spanish Painting, that addresses Casta paintings very explicitly, and that is forthcoming. So in a silent welcome, we'll welcome her to join us today. She will be guiding us in a discussion about Casta paintings. And just as a reminder, I'm sure there will be lots of questions. If you have them, please post them in the Q&A rather than the chat, and we'll be kind of reading through them. And then at the end, I'll field those questions to her so that she doesn't have to read them. So I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction, and thank you to Lauren, Stephen, and Beth for the invitation. So I'm going to talk today about some general questions and ideas about teaching Casta paintings in an introductory level art history course. So just very briefly about Casta paintings, they were largely painted in Mexico, although there is one set that was created in Peru. They portray racial mixing among the three major groups that inhabited colonial Latin America. So that would be indigenous peoples, Spaniards, and Africans. And they were painted in sets of 16. And they typically would show a man and a woman of different races with their children. And they include various types of inscriptions, always including a description of the people's racial mixtures. So they're really fascinating objects because they address so many issues having to do with race, representation, colonialism, the circulation of objects, and so on. And they provide really great bridges in a survey in terms of thinking about the standard kind of European Western canon and moving towards a more global view of the history of art. In this talk, I'm not going to focus on a single Casta painting, though I will talk about some that I think are particularly representative of the genre and well suited for an introductory course. And I'll mention also that part of my goals as an educator is really to help to build the students' analytical skills and their visual literacy. So I often put unknowns before students, whether in the classroom or on exams. And this way they can take what they know and apply it to something new, right? In other words, another Casta painting that they maybe haven't seen before, but that they can understand and interpret based on what they do know. Also, another thing about teaching Casta paintings that's important is to remember that they were created in series, usually a series of 16. So they were created in this way and they were viewed in this way. And for this reason, I think it's particularly important not to view them in isolation as singular art objects, but to think about them sort of in conversation with the other paintings that they were created with, even if you don't have time to show all 16 of them. So the first thing I want to address is kind of in terms of introducing the Casta paintings is how does this topic connect to other topics in the curriculum and sort of how will the objects be introduced. So typically in the survey, the second half of the survey course, I would be spending about 2 weeks on the Baroque. In the first week, it would cover Italian and Northern Baroque. And in the second week, I would introduce Spain and the Latin American Baroque. And so in the first half of the second week of the Baroque topic, they would have learned about Spanish artists like Rivera and Velázquez. And then in the second sort of half of that week, they would have been introduced to the Spanish viceroyalties in the Americas, particularly the viceroyalty of New Spain and Peru. So this is a good way to kind of bring in what they know about the kind of canonical European Baroque and to connect it to Latin America. And this is just one example of how to do this, looking at two examples of the portrait tradition in Baroque painting. On the left, a painting from Mexico by Miguel Cabrera of the sixth Count of Santiago de Calimaya. And on the right, Diego Velázquez's portrait of Philip IV, of course, the Spanish painting. So in this comparison, of course, this is a great, way to get students talking. What do they see? What are the visual similarities that they can see between these two? What would they describe as Baroque, in either one of these portraits? What do they see that's developing in the Latin American context that looks different from what they've already seen in Europe? And, immediately they point out things like the really large cartouche with all these inscriptions that explain who this person is and all the titles that this person holds, as well as the coat of arms that you can see there on the upper left-hand side, which expresses, connection to the Spanish crown, as well as this person's individual sort of lineage. And this helps them to get into thinking about how identity is constructed in Latin America as compared to Spain, right? This insistence on really documenting and making it very obvious this person's lineage within this colonial context, as opposed to in Spain where, of course, everybody knows the king and there's not quite this anxiety at play in terms of the portrait tradition. One thing I'll mention as well for anybody who is teaching the advanced placement course in art history, this Miguel Cabrera portrait of the Count could also be replaced with his portrait of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. That's another idea of a comparison that you could use to bridge these two topics. And ideally, the students would have, read something about, colonial Latin America and the Spanish viceroyalties, of course, before coming into the classroom. So they have some of that background knowledge. Okay, so now that I've kind of positioned us where we are in the semester, I want to look a little bit more specifically at the Casta paintings and to talk about sort of how I would introduce students to the object in the survey course. Just kind of beginning with laying out some of that basic groundwork that I've already mentioned here, talking about Casta paintings painted in Mexico, that they show these kinds of racial, mixtures, that they were painted in sets of 16, and that they, inscribe these racial mixtures. The other thing that I sort of want to point out is that with Casta paintings, and this is of course with so much in our field, it's important to provide a view of these paintings that doesn't focus on any singular narrative. And by that, what I mean is that they're really these fascinating documents of the time that mirror, but they also actively constructed many of the notions of the period regarding colonial society, sort of these different divisions and racial divisions of the society as well. And so what emerges is something that is not static, it's not constant, that different Casta paintings can be interpreted differently, and perhaps we're showing different messages. But overall, they tend to be these types of images that really speak to Spanish and Creole, meaning Spaniards born in the Americas, fears and anxieties about the control of an increasingly racially mixed population, right? And so that is something that I like to kind of, foreground is that these are images that are constructed from this European viewpoint, from this Spanish or Creole viewpoint, even though they represent people of, diverse backgrounds. Part of, how I do that is I like to bring in, primary source quotations and so on. This one here, Francisco Antonio Lorenzana, a Spanish prelate and Archbishop of Mexico, writes, "Two worlds God has placed in the hands of our Catholic monarch, and the new does not resemble the old, not in its climate, its customs, nor its inhabitants. It has another legislative body, another council for governing, yet always with the end of making them alike. In the old Spain, only a single caste of men is recognized. In the new, many and different." So I think this is a good kind of think piece. It doesn't speak specifically to Casta paintings, but it speaks to the way in which, the Spaniard is viewing the difference between the so-called old and new worlds, right? As, being so different in its climate, its customs, its inhabitants. And this idea of many and different castes of people being really fascinating for the Spanish audience. And we can see that here in the Miguel Cabrera painting, where you have, this would be the first of the series where you have the Spanish husband, the indigenous wife, and their mestiza daughter. And you can see that they are, opulently attired. They are in a marketplace, and you can see very fine textiles behind them. All the textiles are labeled. You can see as well some of the sort of fruits and vegetables that are arrayed in front of them. So there's a lot of interest in these paintings of showing this very different climate, these different customs, these different inhabitants that clearly really fascinated the viewer. So at the same time, these paintings were intended really to enlighten and to amuse their audiences. And so one of the kind of strands that we can bring into the conversation when introducing students to this topic, and this I think serves as a good segue, is thinking about the development of these Enlightenment ideas. If we think about the Baroque, when we think back to that comparison I showed earlier between the Spanish and the Mexican examples, we can see that the dates are really quite far apart, almost a century apart. That helps students, I think, to kind of complicate this narrative that everything is kind of fits into these neat boxes, and that these things that we call the Baroque, for example, are only in the 17th century, where we can see these traits over time, spreading, and we can see, the development in Latin America, and then the segue into, these kinds of Enlightenment ideas that they'll be further introduced to once moving to the neoclassical sort of portion of the course. So with these kinds of Enlightenment ideas, the Enlightenment was credited, of course, with, fostering this observation and categorization of all these different manifestations of life, and really gave further impetus to the exploration of other cultures, and prompting this kind of logical arrangement of these new quote unquote discoveries, new to the European audience. This kind of fascination with the other cultures, other in relationship to Europe, of course, has this long tradition. And these paintings themselves, thinking about who created them, who acquired them, many of them were largely intended for export to Spain, right? Where they were curiosities for their illustrations of life in the New World. And this is part of this kind of larger tradition of this kind of Wunderkammer, this interest in these kinds of cabinets of curiosities and collecting that was expanding in this time. And then, so the Casta paintings then, in addition to presenting this kind of typology of the human races and their occupations, they also have this really rich classificatory system, right? Where objects, food products, flora and fauna, all these things are very clearly positioned and labeled, as we can see in both of these paintings. And with this comparison here, again, from the same Casta series by Cabrera, we can see, again, at the beginning, the more sort of upper class with a Spanish father, where the status of the family was oftentimes, tied to having a Spanish father. And they are, as I mentioned before, they are very lavishly attired, indicating their higher social status. As the people become more racially mixed, we can see the diminishing of their social status, right? So that in this painting that comes later in the series, we have from Mestizo, an Indian woman, Coyote. And notice how even the names begin to take on these almost kind of animalistic types of descriptions for these people. And in contrast, when we look at this family, we can clearly tell that they are of a lower social class with tattered clothing, and so on. So they are, in a sense, the Casta paintings devise an artificial classificatory system that was intended from an ideological sort of point of view to emphasize the supremacy of Spaniards, right? That with more Spanish blood, we have this more upper class, family. And as the people become more racially mixed, we can see their of this lower status and lower class. But now what's interesting to think about with the Casta paintings, and really to try to kind of emphasize to the students, is that at the same time that we see these Casta paintings being created that seem to project this idea of this very neatly ordered society where everybody sort of is labeled, right, is placed in these class categories. The 18th century in Mexico showed an increasing blurring of these social boundaries as the consequence of racial mixing, but also in terms of changes in the distribution of wealth. In addition to the frequency of intermarriage, which kind of legitimized these kinds of interracial liaisons, Mexico society was marked by a more frequent passing of one racial or social category to another. And the great economic expansion of this time allowed a number of families of lower social groups, according to this kind of pecking order, descendants from both indigenous and Africans, to amass, in fact, great wealth. And there are, many records that we have from the period where people could actually purchase certificates of legal whiteness called gracias al sacar, thanks for letting me out, basically, where people were able to actually purchase whiteness, right? So these categories that are being laid out in the Casta paintings as if they're immutable, in fact, were all often being transgressed and being, people moving back and forth between these categories. And so in a sense, the emergence of the Casta painting is related to this anxiety regarding this kind of order. And a need to create order, a desire to create order out of an increasingly confusing and mixed society. So the ordering of society in the paintings really underlines the role of classification, right? As a way of rendering visible and making something more stable at a society that was increasingly more fluid. And again, I just bring in this quotation for students to think about, to reflect on. In 1679, the Bishop of Michoacan complained about, quote, the notable disorder in dress, both for its scant honesty and for its indiscriminate use of silks and precious materials, as well as gold, silver, and pearls by nobles and plebeians alike, right? So he's not specifically talking about the castas, but he's talking about this opulence of dress. And we can see that here in this casta painting by Juan Rodriguez Juarez. And, we can see just the great finery of the clothing. The husband here in this kind of Bourbon inspired the French fashion, the indigenous wife in the indigenous type of clothing, the huipil she's wearing. And so, the Casta paintings, particularly the earlier Casta paintings, tend to really emphasize, even regardless of the racial makeup of the family, this kind of wealth and opulence as a way of sort of kind of communicating the great richness of life in the New World. So I wanted to kind of round out the conversation with thinking about the development of Casta painting as a genre. And I brought in these two comparisons. I think it's a really helpful one for students. And the one on the left by Miguel Cabrera is from Spaniard and a Black Woman, a Mulata. And then the one on the right by Andres de Islas, same subject, from a Spaniard and a Black Woman, Mulata, painted, just a few years later. But we can see that there is a marked difference in the way in which this family is rendered. So, one thing to do with this type of comparison, of course, is just ask students, what do you notice? What's different in the way that, these racial categories are being represented in the earlier versus the later Casta painting? And many of them will point out the fact that, the earlier one, the Cabrera painting, it's quite idealized, right? It has this kind of tenderness in terms of the way that the family is rendered. They are, sort of shown in this kind of more idealized light, versus in the Islas painting, where there's obviously this familial discord that's happening, right? There's some kind of conflict between the husband and wife. The child looks terrified as she's kind of grabbing onto her mother. This is also taking place within a slightly different setting. We're getting a little bit more information about where they're located. They're actually within the kitchen, within the domestic space of the home. And there is even more emphasis on the fruits and vegetables and this sort of thing that's all labeled and, very carefully plotted out for the viewer. So this comparison shows us what some scholars of Casta painting, particularly Lona Katsu, lays out, this idea of a kind of first and second generation of Casta paintings. And so we can kind of see some of this kind of development between the two. But the later paintings, the earlier paintings tend to be more idealized with relatively generalized backgrounds. And then the later examples tend to have a greater sense of emotion, greater sense of drama. They often portray some type of familial discord only within the lower classes, the lower castes, in contrast to the ideal domesticity of the higher class families that are rendered within the series. You tend to get also more of these more detailed domestic settings in the later paintings. And so this kind of development of the Casta genre perhaps shows us this kind of increased concern, right, over the possibility or the impossibility of discerning these different social groups in the colony, partly because of the fact that, as I was mentioning before, very fine clothing could often be used to kind of disguise identity or to lift one's status. Concern over loss of these kinds of social boundaries, right? Anxieties of the distinction between the classes, and race being that dominant metaphor that was used. This increased interest in policing these types of boundaries in order to sustain this kind of Spanish imperial power and ensure the exclusivity of its ruling class. So again, within the later painting, we see more physical contact, more motion, initiating a trend, these kinds of trends where, one aspect that we can clearly see in this comparison, and even when looking across various genre sets, is that what you begin to see is this kind of trope of a violent African woman, right? As if this man's, kind of status is falling and is causing this kind of domestic strife by marrying this woman of African descent. So I want to close out by talking about where students have difficulties with the object or the related issues around these objects. I'll start off with something I kind of already touched on, which is kind of this tendency that students have of trying to find one neat answer or neat explanation for Casta painting and what it means, or what they mean in general. As I mentioned before, I tend to give unknowns in a significant portion of their exams. So this asks them again to kind of apply what they already know to examples they haven't seen. But the thing is that Casta paintings aren't consistently uniform in their messaging, as we can really clearly see in this painting, in this comparison. So I brought in this quotation by Elena Adorno, and I have students talk about it and kind of discuss it. And what she says is, often the image created and communicated by the observer had little or nothing to do with what had been seen. To consider the depiction, therefore, is to reflect on the observing subject, right? So that the Casta painting tells us not specifically about, the African woman and the Spanish husband and their mulata daughter. It actually tells us more about how the Spanish or Creole audience wanted to position and view and kind of reify these stereotypes around these types of people. And this quotation in particular, I think, really gets students thinking beyond let me find one single interpretation for this painting. Let's think about all of these kinds of multiple ways that we can understand these paintings and what they and kind of how the painting itself fits into these other themes that I've been mentioning, in terms of the fact that these categories were not so cut and dry, and they were not so kind of clearly defined as the Casta painting would make one believe. And the other thing that I want to point out in terms of thinking about students and some of the stumbling blocks is, of course, to be aware of is that Casta paintings are, of course, reflecting a society with racialized systems of power that still survive to our present day. And of course, right now, the conversations that are and the realities that are happening in our country, and racism and white supremacy and all of these conversations that are happening increasingly right now, these are really hot button topics that are important to bring up and to give students space to discuss. It's important to recognize this outright and to be sensitive to how the material is presented as well as discussed by students. So I'll give you an example of one stumbling block that I had in a class. I had a student, because the titles are written in Spanish, or oftentimes written in Spanish, I've translated them for you here. The student, instead of using the word negro, kept using the word negro. And it was very uncomfortable for numerous people in the class, including myself. And it was really a teaching moment. It was a moment that I had to step in and recognize that this student was basically just pronouncing a Spanish word and directly pronouncing it in English. And the student did not have malintent, but of course we know that the impact is important to recognize, even when the intent is not negative. And so it was something that I had to step in and correct and explain why pronouncing that word in English is inappropriate in this context. And that was actually a teaching moment, because it allowed students to take these paintings and then apply them to broader conversations and issues that we face, up to this day. So with that, I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let's see. Let me see myself here. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk and sharing all of your strategies. Let's see, Ellie, do you want to unshare your screen for a moment? And we'll just get right to the questions. Let's see, and I'll pin myself so people can see me as well. That was really wonderful. And just thinking about also the challenges and how you position it in the class, I think is really helpful for many of us who are thinking about, the broad survey. So we have a number of questions, and let's see here, just I think some pretty straightforward ones. Well, when talking about Casta paintings, I don't know if they're straightforward, but I think someone wanted you to maybe rename again this, or what the certificates of whiteness were called.
Gracias al sacar.
And I think also wondered about sources to suggest learning about them. And I think maybe that might be, just for the sake of time, maybe something we can share on Facebook, and she is also, Ellie's very generously going to also be providing some resources after this talk. So maybe that's something we can have there. So a couple of questions were related to, I think, to location and audience. People want to know about intended audiences and where these were located. And I think with that, are there any in collections here in the US?
Yeah, so the we don't exactly know where a lot of these objects were displayed. They were portable. So there actually are some examples of Casta paintings that have been found that actually still have the scroll on it that were meant to roll it up so that it could be transported. So a lot of them did end up in Spain, and they were collected there. But many we can imagine were also being displayed and collected by criollos, people of Spanish descent in the Americas. And in terms of where you can see them in the United States, I know LACMA has a bunch. And other than that, I'd have to look up for you more specific collections of where you can see them in the United States. There was a show at the Philadelphia Museum that brought the entire minus one of the Miguel Cabrera paintings together, and LACMA, of course, just more recently had a show that had a number of Casta paintings as well. So another question that I think is a challenging one, and I think it gets to what you were talking about at the end, is we had a question about someone mentioned they have a stumbling block when they've used them about domestic violence, and have you encouraged this prior? And if you have, how have you maybe navigated that in the classroom? That's a great question. It's not one that's specifically come up in my class. More of the issues that I've had having to do with the kind of racialized stereotypes and so on. But it's a good point. It's something to consider, particularly, when showing those ones that do show this type of domestic violence in the household. And it's obvious, it's also related to these kinds of negative racist stereotypes, because it's always, this, so on quote unquote, violent, non-European person who's kind of shown as this kind of wild, negative influence. I think it's something that's worth just even, naming outright and not trying to kind of gloss over, as many of these issues. I think sometimes, when you study these objects, you almost become desensitized to some of it because you're so used to seeing this imagery, and it can be shocking to students for the first time. So I really just think naming it and giving students the opportunity to reflect on and to talk about it is really the best advice I can give.
It's a really good idea. Another, I think, basic question that you can answer is, when these are created in sets of 16, does that mean they were 16 separate paintings or 16, vignettes on a single canvas?
Usually they were 16 separate paintings, which is why, kind of assembling an entire set of 16 is a really big deal. There are some examples where they are these small vignettes of 16 that are much smaller on a singular panel. Those are a little bit more rare.
see, we have good questions here. Let's see, a couple more. One of them I think is an interesting one, and that's about whether there's any documented social or political unrest in New Spain at the time these are being created that might explain the anxiety about racial mixing.
Yes, there's a lot. There's a lot of unrest that's happening, and there's a lot of, as I was mentioning in my talk, these kinds of blurring of these lines that were not cut and dry in the way that you know, is presented in the paintings. I can definitely provide some more specific references for that, and also it's discussed in my forthcoming essay in the emotions volume through Brill that Lauren is the editor. So please read that as just another plug.
Yes, please do read it. Let's see, let me see, make sure I didn't forget anything. I think just as a final question that's pretty straightforward is, what are the basic materials that are used for these paintings? Oils, glazes, canvas, things like that.
Yeah, they are oil paintings and you know, oil on canvas. So oil paintings, as I mentioned before, we know that some of them were actually intended to be rolled up as scrolls. So there's like a few examples that still have that that kind of framework of them, which shows us their portability.
All right. Well, thank you everyone. And thank you, Ellie, for such a wonderful teaching talk. I think this is really great. I want to encourage everyone, if you have more questions, you can post them in our Facebook group on the Smart History Commons. You know, I see there's still some questions that we haven't answered, and we will post this online as a video so that you can rewatch it if you want to engage with it a little bit longer. So for now, we'll sign off, and a reminder that in 2 weeks from now, we'll have another one about Hispano-Philippine ivories that I think actually kind of dovetails in some ways with